class. Today we're going to be talking about neuromotor disorders, TBI or traumatic brain injury, not image, injury, and language. How do these two things affect language, and what is your role as special education teachers in this whole thing? So here are our goals for today. We're going to define these two things. We're going to identify factors that can influence how these disorders present, talk about how they influence speech and language, and then the most important part for you guys, we're going to talk about how you can support students who have these disorders and improve their communication. So one big definition that we need to talk about for today is aphasia. Aphasia is a loss of expressive or receptive language that results from brain damage. It happens to people who get strokes, traumatic brain injuries, anything like that can result in aphasia. And then our two big things are neuromotor disorder. These are anything that happens to your nervous system that impair your ability to move. ALS, cerebral palsy, spina bifida are all examples of this. And then we have traumatic brain injury, which is an injury to your brain that impacts how it works. Lots of people have these two disorders, sadly, and sadly, lots of young people experience these disorders. So we're going to talk about ways you can experience them. But before we can do that, we have to have an understanding of what is your nervous system. So it's the control center of your body. It's how you decide what to do, how to move what muscles, all of that stuff. You've got your central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. And then you have your peripheral nervous system. So those are the nerves that run through your whole body and communicate. They connect your brain and your spinal cord with your muscles and your stomach and all other parts of your body. So we've got some information about the brain here. It has many different parts, and many of these parts are associated with different functions that you do. So there are some parts of your brain that are more responsible or more active in helping you remember things. There are some parts of your brain that help you process hearing and visual information. There are some parts of your brain that are really responsible for balance and coordination. And the location of the injury or disease on your brain really impacts what disorders are going to be tricky for you. You also have these things called glial cells. You can see them here at the bottom right of the slide. These make up your entire nervous system, and they all communicate with each other. So this is how your brain is able to control itself. So here is some very basic information about how your brain works. You have several lobes of your brain. You have the frontal lobe, which is the part underneath your forehead. The parietal lobe, that's the top part of your brain. The temporal lobe, that's the side aptly named by your temporal region, your temples. And then your occipital lobe in the very back of your head. And these all have different things. So your frontal lobe is really, really important with motor movement and some of those executive functioning skills. So these are things like planning, attention, problem solving, controlling yourself. People with poor executive functioning tend to blurt out things or say things they may not want to say because they have this trouble inhibiting themselves. You have your temporal lobe, which is, again, that side by your temple. And this is really important in processing hearing and the sounds that we hear. So it's got a good role in speech with that bit. And it also has a role in short-term memory. The parietal lobe, this is the area of your brain that helps you identify where you are in space, what you're touching. And it also has a role in the understanding of language. And then you have your occipital lobe in the back, and that's really an important part of processing visual information. And interesting enough, that part of the brain is less affected by autism, which is why visuals work so well. That part is active, it's moving, and it processes that visual information. So again, it's a lot more complicated than that. This is not a neurology class, but this is just kind of a basic overview of some of those parts of your brain. So because of that, we know there are factors that impact neurological disorders and injuries. So obviously it's that location. If you get an injury to your frontal lobe, you're more likely to have motor movement problems as well as problems with that executive functioning. So that attention, memory, planning, impulsivity, all those good stuff. The size of your impacted area, which makes sense. If you got a big old injury or a lot of your brain is impacted, you're more likely to have more functional problems. And then the time since the injury or disease started. So generally speaking, if you've had a disease for a long time and it's been affecting you over many, many years, you're going to have a lot more problems from it. And there's also this idea that we make the most recovery right after our injury. So, and then certain kinds of injuries, you can continue to make progress, but it's not quite as much as the recovery you get right after that injury happens. So let's talk a little bit about language and movement, because it's kind of important when we're talking about these neuromotor disorders that impact your movement overall. So in general, babies who show motor delays often also show speech and language delays. This study that I'm quoting or citing here, they found a really direct link between the ability to sit up and your receptive language, or your ability to understand language. There are some people that kind of theorize that learning how to move helps you explore the world and learn language concepts, which kind of makes sense. If you're playing around with a ball and you keep setting it on the table and your mom says, "Oh, you're putting it on," you're learning about the world around you. And helping children with motor impairments also improves their ability to communicate. It's really important for our students who use AAC devices, but also it allows them to encourage the world, experience things, and all that stuff. And there's been some findings that kids who get high quality physical therapy services have improved speech and language outcomes too. So I got to thank this physical therapist in my life, which I have many. And that gets us into this. So my mom, my brother, my sister-in-law, and my cousins are all physical therapists. So I think I know that role really well. And I have several friends that are also PTs. Their big role is to teach people how to move their bodies, also how to position their bodies so they get the best movement. It's stuff like using wheelchairs and getting them in standers and helping them move around, and also helping them reduce pain from injury. So a lot of adults see physical therapists after they've had an injury or if they've got a back problem, stuff like that. And then there are occupational therapists. These are therapists who help people improve their ability to do everyday activities. They work on fine motor skills. So those are those precise movements of your hands. Handwriting, using buttons, and all those stuff are fine motor activities. And they also help people regulate their sensory system. So some people have big sensory problems and they need a lot of input, or they want to spin all the time, and occupational therapists help them get good sensory input so that they're better regulated and able to go throughout their day. So you'll see at the bottom of these pictures, that's me, my brother, and my mom on the far left, and my sister-in-law too. They're all physical therapists in my life. And this is my good friend and one of my favorite coworkers, Miriam Zayat. She's a fabulous OT, and we did tons of co-treating with our students with autism. So you can see in the middle, she's working with a student on a ball. He really liked getting sensory input where his head was hanging down. So she would help him go on the ball and do some rocking exercises. And then I would come and help him ask to go on the ball. I would use his AAC device to say, "More ball, please." Then you see us again co-treating a student with autism. Their faces are blurred out for privacy. I was showing them different language modeling, and I was showing them put in and that concept of in for language. And Miriam was helping them with the fine motor movement of holding onto the ball, tossing it one place. So this is a great example of collaborative treatment. So this is one of my, you're not supposed to have favorites, but he is one of my favorite students. I can't lie to you guys. He's a student that has a neuromotor disorder. If you see his hand, if you see it kind of twitching and moving like that, those are all movements that he can't control himself. And he can't speak at all, no spoken language. And he was really getting frustrated because that arm kept twitching and preventing him from like doing something. So he'd go to grab that joystick, which you'll see, and then his hand would jerk out of the way and he couldn't hold it. And that joystick is part of his AAC device. We couldn't really get a lot of success with him touching. All that jerking movement made it way too hard to use an eye gaze device. So the joystick was really our best kind of option for him. So this is me. I asked the physical therapist that I work with to help me position him so that jerking arm movement was less impactful on him. And the OT helped us figure out exactly what size and shape we wanted the joystick. And then after that was all done, I did a language activity with him. There's that arm jerking around.
Can you bring left hand up?
That's the PT talking. So yeah, after we don't want to see that again. So after that was all done, his body was a little calmer. He had that arm kind of tucked away, and he was able to use his good hand to hold the joystick and participate in our speech activity. And then hopefully, when all of us therapists get this together, we would send that whole system to the classroom and he could use that throughout his school day. Okay. So now that we've kind of talked about those things, let's talk about neuromotor disorders. So the first one we're going to talk about is cerebral palsy. And this is all information from the Centers for Disease Control. So this is a brain disorder that occurs either at birth or shortly before birth, or shortly after birth, I'm sorry, that affects the brain's ability to control the muscles. So it can impact your ability to move around and walk and jump and do all that good stuff, and also maintain your balance and your posture. And it can look very different for different people. I work with, I think we've talked about this before, the SXI program. So that stands for severe multiple impairment. So a lot of those students have very involved cerebral palsy that damaged huge amounts of their brain, and they can't walk and they can't control their body at all and have a lot of problems with that. And I also have a teacher that I work with who has cerebral palsy, and her gait is different. She has trouble walking, but other than that, you really wouldn't know that she had a disability unless she told you. Cerebral palsy can affect your whole body, half of your body, or just one body part even. It can be that small. So for that student you saw me working with, his whole body was affected, but half of his body was really, really affected by his cerebral palsy. And there are several different types. There's spastic cerebral palsy. This is when your body sends out basically sends out too many signals to your muscles, and it makes them contract and tighten up all the time. So that makes it difficult to move when your muscles are always tight. There's dyskinetic. That's the type of cerebral palsy that you saw in the video. That's when a person has jerky, uncontrollable muscle movements, or slow, but whatever it is, it's muscle movements that are not in your control. So they impact with your purposeful movement. And then we have ataxic. So that is a type of cerebral palsy where you have trouble with balance and coordination. So, as you can imagine, it has huge impacts, or very different types of impacts depending on what's going on. A lot of people have trouble with speech because they have difficulty controlling the muscles that allow them to talk. It can range from absolutely no speech, like you saw in that video. It can make you difficult to understand, or it can just maybe affect you a little bit. And also depends on how much of your brain is impacted by that injury that caused your cerebral palsy. So in our SXI program, some of them have huge disorders learning language as a whole. Some of them have huge difficulty learning um, speech and moving their body. And some also have some vision problems from the brain damage. It went all the way to that occipital lobe. So all those things kind of can impact how that changes. So the next disorder we're going to talk about is something called spina bifida. So this is a birth defect of your spinal cord. So sometimes it's really severe, as you can see in these pictures below, where huge chunks of your spinal cord come out through this little opening in it, and it can cause paralysis and trouble moving. It can be just a little fluid bubble without part of the spinal cord in it, or it can just be a weak area in the spinal cord. So obviously the most severe is when you've got a whole chunk of that spinal cord coming into your fluid-filled bubble. And kind of the least severe is when you just have that little gap with no fluid sac. And sometimes because you have fluid that flows from all around your spinal cord and your brain, if you have this fluid-filled sac, it can kind of interrupt that flow and called something called hydrocephalus, which is fluid on your brain that pushes down and can cause damage. And that affects people with spina bifida in different ways. So this is a direct quote from the Spina Bifida organization. Many children with spina bifida have average IQs. Some are even gifted. I knew a woman who was a medical doctor with spina bifida. Some can have hydrocephalus tends to be the one that really can impact it. Sometimes they can have health problems that impact their performance. So obviously, if you're not feeling good and your spina bifida and hydrocephalus cause other things, you're not going to be as good in school when you're feeling like crap or not feeling great. They tend to have higher verbal IQs compared to like some of their math and cognitive IQs, and trouble with their hand-eye coordination. So handwriting can be really tricky for them. And their grades in reading and spelling tend to be better than math. All right. And there is also this idea that some people with spina bifida have cocktail party syndrome. So when we talk about cocktail party syndrome, this is the idea that in a social situation, you can appear typical. You're very chatty, your speech sounds normal, you can carry on conversations, but when you get down to it and you're out of that social environment, and you really test those cognitive skills like in school, that's when difficulties pop up. Speech and language can appear normal, but sometimes they have trouble using language creatively. So coming up with lots of different ideas and using language for lots of different situations. And they also have some trouble on parts of receptive language and testing in that area. And then there is epilepsy. This is a brain disorder that causes seizures. So a seizure is when you have an abnormal amount of electrical activity. So to overly simplify, your brain uses electricity to communicate and come up with every thought is like a little electric jolt in it. So a seizure is when you have a storm, too much of it goes off in one spot. And sometimes seizures can be really, really obvious. Like you'll see someone jerking around, and you've probably even seen this in like a movie or in your personal life where they jerk and they twitch and it looks really awful. There's also, they're called petite mal seizures, and these just kind of look like someone staring off into space. And these can be really hard because they're easy to miss unless you're really looking at that child. And then obviously, how long you've had the seizures and where the seizure happens really, really depends on how it impacts your speech and language. I have a friend who is a speech language pathologist who had really bad seizures. She had epilepsy because she had a tumor on her brain. So she's an amazing lady, and because she was able to get medical help relatively quickly, it didn't impact and her seizures happened kind of in areas that don't affect her speech and language. She's okay. She's doing great. She has more trouble. She lost her ability to see like her peripheral vision because the seizures happen more in a place where you're in that occipital lobe where visual information is processing. So that's just an example of some of that complexity. But if you have your seizures in maybe your frontal lobe, it can impact those speech motor movements, and it can impact maybe your impulsivity. I had a student that had seizures in that area, and he was very impulsive. He would, oh my God, I can't count the number of times he ran out the door and would just like go, go, go. And he had problems with speech. He was kind of hard to understand. So some of those factors influence how your epilepsy impacts you. All right, and then we're going to talk about some progressive neuromotor disorders. So when we say progressive, that means it gets worse over time. And these are lots of different types. I'm not going to go over every single one on the slide. You can read those yourself. But they can be really, really hard because almost all of these result in you slowly losing control of your whole body. And it can be really emotionally difficult and really painful. And very sadly, a lot of people with these disorders lose their lives way too young. If you ever participated in the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, the money for the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge was to go to support people with specifically ALS, which is a type of muscular dystrophy. It's also called Lou Gehrig's disease. And it's almost always fatal, but there's lots of different types, as you can see here. So these disorders don't have too much of a impact on language. There's some mixed results that it might affect you a little bit, but the biggest impact you're going to see on speech. Your speech will kind of start off normally, but eventually it will get worse and worse over time. And many, many people with these progressive neuromotor disorders will be completely unable to speak, can't move their hands, can't do anything like that. So they're going to need eye gaze communication systems, which are amazing. They can really help people stay functional for a long time. So if you look at the bottom, these are all examples of eye gaze communication systems. On the very right-hand quarter, that's a low-tech eye gaze pencil, which is really cool. And you should keep that in mind as teachers. So that person will look at a corner and then the teacher works with them to figure out which letter they want. And the other two are computerized eye gaze devices, which send out a little infrared light beam into your eye and they can read where your eye is going, which is really cool. And again, I just really want to emphasize that these disorders almost always limit someone's lifespan by quite a bit. So when you have students with this, it's really important to keep that in mind because, the parents are obviously grieving, and you have to plan kind of differently than you would for a child who maybe they had cerebral palsy, but their disorder is not going to get worse over time. In fact, they're probably going to get better. So you have to kind of come at it with a different headspace and you kind of have to plan for the future. You may have a child that doesn't need an eye gaze device right now. They can point, they can show you things, and they can even talk. But if you wait until they're completely unable to move or talk, they may not be able to use the equipment then. So that's something to keep on your heart. I really had to talk about this. I have a student that has muscular dystrophy, and his teacher was really not into the idea of him having an eye gaze device because it's so expensive. It's kind of hard to use. And quite honestly, he doesn't need it right now. He can still talk. But with the way his disease is progressing, I really want to have him use it right away and get comfortable using it because we don't know when he's going to need it. So something to keep in mind when you're doing that. So what is your role as a teacher? Quite honestly, the biggest role is to work collaboratively with PT, OT, speech, and make sure that your students are as independent as possible. Oftentimes, a neuromotor disorder makes it hard for people to do things by themselves. So your job is to give them all the adaptive equipment to do things that they can. So having OT figure out a best way for the student to write independently, having PT position them in a way so they can move around the classroom and get to things they need, and using AAC. And I really want to highlight the fact that you want to use it in the same way that your students do. So, for example, you saw my friend who used the joystick for his AAC device. When I modeled with him, sometimes it was really easy just to point, and I would lose it, but he kind of didn't know how to use that joystick. So when I modeled with him, I had to switch to putting my hand on the joystick and moving the device just the way he did. And this last point we're going to talk about a lot more is avoiding hand-over-hand prompting. So why is it bad? First and most importantly, it kind of teaches people with disabilities that they don't have control over their own bodies. If you're taking someone's hand and dragging it around, it kind of says, you're going to do what I want to do right now. It can cause learned helplessness. So if you do something for somebody over and over again, they kind of never learn how to do it on themselves. When you're testing kids, especially when you're using hand over hand, it can be difficult to figure out who did what. This is so true when you use communication devices. If you're hand over hand prompting a kid, it can be hard to tell, like, okay, did they want to say that? Was that what they wanted to say? Or was that me guiding them to that? And for me, kind of most importantly for us who are working in education, is that it does not help people with disabilities learn. There's some research that shows that people with disabilities who watch someone do something, learn, and then tried to copy it by themselves had much more learning than when someone physically guided their hand to do it. So that's just a note to keep in mind. We want to avoid hand over hand when we can. And this is just that infographic that I got a lot of information about. Feel free to zoom in. So this is an example of a morning routine for a student with neuromotor impairments. So they start off in their wheelchair. They use the adapted fork provided with them for their OT so they can independently scoop food into their mouth. They are toileted, and then they are put into their walker so they can go to circle time. They sit down in a different chair. This is adapted so it's got support on the side of their body. And then they use their AAC device to select the month and the year and choose a day of the week song. They use their walker to get to their reading centers. They use AAC for their phonological activity. And then they go to the writing center where they work with adaptive pencils. And then again, they transition back to their wheelchair to go to recess and lunch. So just a thought of all the different ways that you as a teacher can work on movement, using AAC, using that adaptive equipment so they can do as much of that as they possibly can. All right, and then here's another thought about neuromotor disorders. When you're testing students, it's really important to make sure that you're testing the right thing. So for example, if you're testing kids and you're asking them to point at the right answer and they have trouble pointing at things, you may not be figuring out whether they know the information or not. You may be figuring out, oh man, maybe it's hard for them to find the right picture, point to the right picture. And it's important to always use adapted books that they can turn the pages and you can make them on PowerPoint. And adapted writing equipment, which our OTs are fabulous at getting. This can be anything from a pencil with a big old grip on it to, that eye gaze device that I showed you. So lots of different stuff. All right, and that gets us into the traumatic brain injury portion of this test. So TBI can be caused by lots of different things. It can become from an open head injury where you can see it. Sadly, in this world we live in, that's a lot of times from a gunshot. It can be closed head where your brain bounces around in the skull and causes damage. It can be anoxic where your brain doesn't have oxygen for a long time. So if somebody drowns, if someone is like choked and they lose oxygen, those can all cause brain injuries. And then obviously the type of problems depend on the location and severity. Generally speaking, anoxic brain injury, because it's your whole brain that's not getting what it needs, tend to be really, really severe. And my students that have had anoxic brain injuries tend to have the worst, I shouldn't say worst, the most impactful injuries that affects like every part of their functioning. And then we've talked about it before, but I'm going to say it again. Generally speaking, recovery occurs really quickly right after the injury and then slows down over time. So it's really important to do a lot of work right after that injury occurs to help do the rehab. And this is just an example of how a brain in a closed head injury happens. So concussions are also an example of a more mild traumatic brain injury, which is why you want to avoid them. And if you recall from, there's been a lot of talk with the NFL and that chronic brain injury that football players get. they're getting lots of concussions and their brain is bouncing around just like this infographic. So it can be very difficult. And TBI has effects on lots of different things, just like all of our other injuries. It depends on where your injury takes place. If you, for lack of a better term, if you get shot in the back of your head, you can lose your ability to see like everything because that part of your brain that interprets vision is gone. It's been really damaged. It can totally impact your motor movements, especially speech, or including speech, especially if that frontal lobe area is damaged. It can also cause problems with behavior and emotional regulation, and changes in your personality. People, especially with those frontal lobe injuries, who may have been like very calm, very level-headed, can suddenly look like, oh my God, they're just flying around, they're doing whatever, they're not thinking before they talk. And it can be really tricky. When I was a student in graduate school, I worked with people who had TBI, and I was waiting in the very front office with another student who was becoming a speech therapist. And this man was a very handsome gentleman. One of the people who had a frontal lobe injury with her husband, who was walking to her room, goes up to this student, this male student, squeezes his big muscular arm and goes, "Ooh, hey, handsome, why can't we go to the back room together?" Which is wildly inappropriate. And her husband was right there. But because she had difficulty, shutting that down and not saying exactly what she thought when she thought it, that was all a part of her brain injury, part of that impulsivity. Again, problems with problem solving, memory, attention, depending on where it goes. And these are some notes from your book. More mild TBI tends to affect your understanding more than your expressive, and then moderate to severe TBI can affect expressive, receptive, and pragmatic language altogether, and it can be really tricky. That lady who had that injury, in addition to her, that problem with that impulsivity, that's also kind of a pragmatic issue, right? Not knowing that it's kind of a bad idea to do that in front of your husband is a social language thing. That's not appropriate. It's not funny. It made him feel very uncomfortable. Okay, I'm lying. It was a little funny. I still laugh about it. But, if it was a different thing, she could get in big trouble for doing that, right? So all those things are really important to keep in mind when we're talking about traumatic brain injury. And these are from your book, and I thought they were so great. These are recommendations for teachers who work with students for TBI. So just like every other thing, it's really important to have a strict routine in a classroom that has few distractions. I think this is especially important for people with TBI because they often have so many problems with attention and focusing and concentrating. So the more distractions you have in your classroom, including decorations on the wall, people walking in, people talking during your lesson, can't have it. Although pupil to teacher ratio is always important for everything, but again, it's part of that distraction, right? Fewer students help you focus and make a calmer, quieter environment. And students with TBI need lots of repetition. You got to do things over and over again. You got to teach them for months for them to stick. And then when they do stick, you want to practice your new skill in a lot of different environments. This is called generalization. When you have that injury, you can maybe learn it in one setting, but you may not be able to do it out on the street, at the store. So when you ever work with a student with TBI, things like community-based instruction can be really, really important. Let's say you do a math lesson, and you learn how to count change. Can you do it at the grocery store? Can you do it with your friends? All those things are so important. And then you also want to explicitly talk about strategies that improve your attention, concentration, and memory. You can say things like, oh, it's when I have music on in the background, it's hard for me to focus. Talk about how to use a planner and write things down and keep a schedule. Talk about how you improve your own attention, and teaching them how to think about their learning can really help them. And of course, just like all the other things, you want speech, OT, and PT to be a part of your classroom and to work collaboratively. You want PT to come up with motor things for you to do. You want OT to help you figure out routines that you make your students independent. And you want speech to help you come up with ways to improve their language throughout the day and use those all the time. Another important thing is to work with your social worker to help students adjust to the emotional impact. I don't think I've really emphasized this enough, but I really want to say this again. It can be really hard for caregivers and students to adjust to life with a brain injury. Your whole personality can be so different, and it's really, really tricky. You can go from a very quiet, very responsible, very thoughtful kid to someone who's blurting out answers and rude and doing really risky behavior. And it can be so frustrating for parents and for the student because people aren't treating them differently. They can't do all the things they used to do. So, having a social worker work on that emotional impact is really important. And I think that really goes with all of these disorders. Um, the neuromotor disorder, obviously, these are young children that are facing dying if they've got types of muscular dystrophy that cause that. And that's a lot to process emotionally. And being really sensitive to that is so important. My mom is a physical therapist and she works in the schools. And I remember she told me about a young man who had something called Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And that is truly horrendous. It will kill you by the time you are um, very young. Sorry for the ding. It will kill you by the time you're 18, not to mince words. And the student was really sad. And the teacher kept going, I think he's got depression. He's crying all the time. And it's like, well, wouldn't you be depressed if you were going to die at 18 and you couldn't do the things that you wanted to do? That's a pretty big blow. So all of those things, TBI, neuromotor things, you want to really be considerate of the emotional impact that those have on your students. And then, just like always, you want to build a link between parents and the school because they are dealing with so much. They're with all of these, with many of these neuromotor disorders, they're kind of losing the child again. They're looking at something that a lot of people don't. So they need to really feel supported. You need to work with them and make sure they feel comforted and that you got it and that you're aware of that consideration. So all those things are super important. All right, and that's it. Here are the citations for today. Thanks so much, guys.